Hey bass anglers, today we're going to talk about catching spring bass on docks, and we're going to talk about 4 key things to consider when you're out there looking to improve your odds to catch fish this time of year. Not only is there transition in the spring, but there can be transition on any given day in the spring depending on what happens. Did it warm up? Is it cooling off? And all of that can play in to where you're finding them. But step 1 is finding out the area of the lake. So if we're using a lake like Lake Murray, that's got, hundreds if not thousands of docks in any given part of the lake, you've got to break it down. And the first thing to do is find creek arms, and that's where we're going to start. We're going to break down this massive body of water, which sometimes those fish can be out there on main lake stuff, but in the springtime there's this migration that moves from the main lake to the creeks to the pockets for the spawn. And so that transition thought is important as we move forward here. So we're going to break the lake down and we're going to pick a creek arm, start from the outside edge of that creek arm, and we're going to work our way back into individual spawning pockets, thinking about dock proximity and dock positioning and dock isolation along the way. So we're going to start in a creek. Second part of it is, which docks do we consider? What do we target first for docks? And the way I like to look at it is I want to think about this transition too. As the fish come in out of the main lake and they first hit that creek arm, the first docks going into that creek arm are going to be important docks. And then every pocket that you get into, and some pockets are bigger than others and some pockets are smaller, and if a pocket has a dock on it, you want to hit that first dock inside that pocket. So first docks inside the creek arm and then first docks inside the pocket are going to be ones to consider. And they could be, they're staging. That's where they might wad up and you'll have multiple fish in one location on these particular docks. So they're ones that you definitely need to check. The other thing to consider is isolated docks. Now, if that first dock going into a creek arm or that first dock going into a pocket is an isolated dock, that can make things even better because it's the only piece of cover around. You can see here, and even on the flat contours of some of these creeks as you go in, there's not a lot of features that along the shoreline. It's just a gradually tapering shoreline. If there's no brush piles or other things to grab them, that dock might be the first big piece of cover that they'll stage on. So, important thing to do is get into the creeks towards the pockets. Think of that flow from cool to warm as that spawning period goes. You'll want to move from the outside of the creeks back into the pockets, and then you're looking for the isolated docks. That takes us to number 3, is which areas of the dock to focus on. So let's say we get to one of these key docks. There's 3 areas I think really are thirds of a dock system, and you'll see this definitely on most of the docks on these flowage type systems, these impounded river systems that have a lot of creek arms and stuff, is they'll have 3 distinct sections of docks. And the first section is from the shoreline, and it's substructural components of the dock to kind of get the docks established into the lake. And it's got a series of posts that work their way out. That's the first section. Then the second third of the dock is that walkway that's going to bridge out to the third section, which is the floating part of the dock. So there's a floating section in deeper water, there's a walkway, and then there's the substructural component of the dock that's up by the shoreline. And at any given time during the transition of the spawn or during the transition of the day, depending on how cool it is in the morning and how much it warms up later in the day, those fish will move around on that dock from deep in the coolest parts where they're just staging, and then they'll stage in the middle third under the walkways, and they might spawn up under the structural subcomponents. So this exact scenario and this information that I'm talking about those thirds of the dock, really played out in this Major League Fishing. It was Power Stop Stage 3 of the Major League Fishing Circuit on Lake Murray, March 6th through the 9th, 2025. And after all of the days of fishing, it came down to a battle between Drew Gill and Jacob Wheeler. And in the later part of the day, after their scope periods were done, it really came down to dock fishing and who was going to catch the final fish. They were very tightly wadded up there with weight within a scoreable bass from each other from who was going to win that tournament right down into the final minutes. And what it turned out to be, in my estimation watching it, was that Drew Gill had earlier in the tournament picked up on the cooler day, day 3, that was cloudy, there wasn't sun like there was in the first 2 days. And in the first couple of days of that tournament, Mark Daniels Jr. and Jacob Wheeler and others, in fact everybody, was catching fish in that first and second third of that dock. That shallower part of the dock is where they were staging fish. And on day 3, that was in their mind, that those first couple days of success and their pre-fishing success were on those shallower parts of the dock. And then lo and behold, on day 3, we don't get any sun, and we get a cooler night, and we get a cooler day. I think the water temperature I saw on Mark Daniels Jr.'s graph was 51 degrees here at noon. So the water was very cold, and the fish were out under the floating section of dock staging. They had pulled out. I talked about earlier how fish are going to move from those thirds of the dock depending on the season and depending on the day as they get to that full spawning mode, and weather pulls them back out, and weather allows them to come back in. So Gil picked up on it, and I saw him pick up on it late in day 2 actually on a dock, because he was using his forward-facing sonar in a period when he was fishing docks. He didn't have a ton of success, I didn't think, out on the whole time out on the main lake. It was either him or somebody else in the tournament had swung their sonar, their live-facing, forward-facing sonar, under a floating section of dock, and there was all kinds of nice fish wadded up, suspended under the floating section of the dock. And they were able to, you could see the fish when they threw their bait in there, it would follow it all the way down to the bottom. The fish would go down, and they had to fish it very slowly, and sometimes those fish would follow that bait out 30 feet before they would bite it. So that was a key thing that he picked up on, and you'll see here in some video where this is in the final minutes of the tournament, where he's targeting the floating end of the dock, and then you'll see Jacob over here targeting that second and first third of the dock, and that turned out to be the critical difference between those two. So think about that as you're fishing out there, that transition happens not only in the season. If everything were to remain stable, we know it always doesn't, and there's days that are colder and the fish will pull back out, and when they pull out, they don't necessarily pull off the dock, they'll just pull out and suspend under the floating portions of it, and then when it warms up, they'll move under those other components, either the walkways or the substructural elements in the shallowest part. But always keep that in your mind, keep those thirds in your mind, and if you're not using forward-facing sonar, test those thirds before you leave a productive dock, and even one that's got potential, being one of the first ones into a pocket or a creek arm, or being an isolated one. Then on the business end of all of this, what are we going to use? And for me, I'm almost always going to start with a Senko. If you're a beginner at dock fishing, this is the easiest thing to start with, and you're going to wacky rig it. In the way that I like to wacky rig it is I'll use a little wacky rig banding crimper, and I'll get a silicone band, and some people will use the little O-rings, like got an O-ring tool here where you would put your worm on or your Senko in and pull this O-ring over it onto the middle of it, and then you'd hook up on that. But I prefer to use a band, and I'll use this banding tool, and I'll pull the band out to the center of the Senko, pop that band off right there in the center, and now I've got a band. And when I hook that thing up using a size 1 wacky rig hook, I'll come right straight 90 degrees through that band, and that keeps that thing from coming off. And then if you look, there's enough of the point showing, but not too much of the point, where the worm takes up a fair amount of the gap of the hook, but the point's still there. And to me, this thing is going to skip a lot easier. It's going to get hung up less. There are some other things out on the market. I'll put up a picture here of the VMC crossover. Jacob Wheeler and others were using this VMC crossover, but you can see the difference between the little teeny bit of hook exposure that I've got there and the gap that's taken up with the hook and how much of the hook is exposed with that VMC, I feel like this gets hung up less. I have more success with it. And with the band, silicone bands, these things are far cheaper than those VMC crossover bands. So save yourself some money and use a silicone, just a silicone band. And this thing skips like a dream on a spinning rod. I would use 12-pound fluorocarbon line to a, say, 15-pound braid and a spinning rod. And you're not setting the hook, you're just reeling tight and just doing kind of a lean set on these fish and then easing them out of the structural elements of the dock. If you do a regular hook set, you're going to break a lot of stuff. You want to ease into them with this small gear. You've got a size 1 drop shot hook and you're using spinning gear because this is a finesse presentation. You're skipping this thing into the nether world under the dock and you're able to get a lot of nice fish out by just being careful, applying some pressure, and just kind of leaning into them a little bit. And I do have a video specifically on that, what I just talked about with the how to get them out of that dock situation and how to present it and cast in there and what that whole hook set situation looks like. I'll link that at the end of the video. But Senko, and I'll use a 5-inch Senko and then I'll use a 4-inch Senko, and I'll try those two things before I move on. In the tournament, Drew Gill and Jacob Wheeler were using some other special baits. Drew Gill was using his signature version of Big Bite Baits Neko bait, and I'll put that Neko up on the screen, and it's got the unique little band spot for it, so you can see the little slot for the rubber O-rings in a couple of positions. And he'll put a nail weight in the end of it, a really light nail weight, and then he'll hook it up in the center there. The other is Jacob Wheeler. Jacob Wheeler was using his signature version of Rapala's Janitor, and you can see that that worm also has a slot on there for an O-ring, and they were putting a nail weight in it. And I think the difference, there was some pros using Senkos, Wacky rig Senkos, and there was some pros using the Neko rig. I would suggest if you're a novice for simplicity, starting out with just using the Wacky rig Senko weightless. There's enough salt in these baits that they're going to sink reasonably fast, and it's a finesse presentation, so having it be slow is not going to matter right now. The water's cold. These fish are staging. A lot of times they're suspended, and as it's falling slowly by them, they might even hit it on the fall rather than follow it down. But in this case, in the pro tournament, they were using these Neko rig setups, both Jacob and Drew were, but it takes more skill to skip that. You have to use a lot more force to skip that thing because it's got a nail weight on the end of it. And anytime you weight anything and you try to skip it, it can be difficult. You'll see if you watched it like I did that there was any number of doinks and dings. They looked like amateurs. They look like an amateur using a Senko, a pro using a Neko rig. So it can be very difficult to get that Neko rig to skip cleanly under there. When they do, they're very successful because it falls down and the Neko weighted end of it goes right down on the bottom and stands up with those worms, and a lot of times they're able to kind of jiggle it in place or move it a couple of inches or move it a foot at a time and kind of fish their way slowly back out of that area. And they were able to get some bites that way, I think, where maybe they outfished some of the Senko fishermen, but definitely a lot more difficult. I could see that Mark Daniels Jr., Jacob Wheeler, Drew Gill were all using the Neko rig. And then there were some other pros, like I said, that used the Senko, but Senko far easier to skip with. So 3 great bait choices to use in this spring period around a dock when they're staging from coming from the lake, moving into the creek arms, moving into the pockets, staging on docks, figuring out what third of the dock they're on depending on the weather. Whether if you've got forward facing to help you, you can find them and see them on there. And if you don't, experiment with those different ranges on those keys. And then once you start to catch them, you're going to develop a pattern. Okay, today they're on the first third, they're on the second third, they're out floating on the floating end, and you'll be able to develop a pattern, and then you can bounce around the lake and you'll have a successful day. So there you have it. Some tips on how to catch spring bass on docks and to think about the whole thing a little more dynamically to help you become more successful at putting some bass in the boat. Hope these tips were helpful. Please like and subscribe, and we'll talk to you next time on the water.